Good morning, Roger. How are you?
I am well, JR. Good morning to you and the other members on the panel.
Good to see you this morning, Roger. Good to see you. It's always a pleasure to have you. Our audience, they just rave every time you're on. So we're happy to have you. So let's get right to it, Roger. When we look in the news, we see that Roger Stone is a free man. You know, they're calling it historic corruption. Roger Stone was arrested and charged with witness tampering and all the rest of it. And he is now commuted by our president. I would love to get your take on that.
Okay. Roger Stone. Whether you like him or not, whether you espouse any of his positions or you and he are best friends, he was granted a presidential clemency. And folks have to understand there's a difference between a pardon and a commutation. And what he got was a commutation. Now, under our Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, the president has the absolute, unfettered, unbridled power to pardon. That's one of the perquisites of being the president. Now, the only limitation on that is the pardon cannot be used during an impeachment. That's the only limitation. So, for example, the person's pardoned by a president could be an individual who was convicted of murder, who was convicted of child molestation, of embezzlement, of any crime that's a federal crime. Now, the difference between a pardon and a commutation is as follows. A pardon is an outright evisceration or wiping the slate clean of your conviction. So after being pardoned, you would no longer have a criminal record, and it would restore you to all of your civil liberties. For example, you would now have the right to vote, you could own a firearm, you could get certain civil service positions, you would have no criminal record if you are pardoned. On the other hand, a commutation of your sentence is a forgiving of your sentence or a lessening of your sentence, and maybe if you had a fine attached to that sentence, wiping out that fine. However, you will still have on the books a criminal record. You still would have been convicted of whatever crime. You'll still be a felon, and you won't be restored with your civil liberties. So, for example, the things that I mentioned earlier in regards to being able to vote, have a firearm, and the like, you no longer will be able to have those privileges. You just won't go to prison, and you won't have to pay a fine. So what our president did about a week ago today was commute the sentence of his good friend, Roger Stone. Now that left a somewhat bitter taste in the mouths of a lot of Americans, because it seems inherently unfair that a friend of the president who was convicted of a crime that may have benefited the president, he could then commute that person's sentence. There seems to be something wrong with that. It feels wrong. It feels like possible corruption. It feels like an abuse of power. Maybe obstruction of justice. All of the above may be thoughts and feelings that you may have, but legally he had a right, he being the president, the right to do that. Now, discretion is important. Now, when you have that level of power, I think you should use it with a certain degree of discretion so it doesn't have the appearance of impropriety. So it doesn't look bad, it doesn't smell bad. And that's what it looks like right now. Now, what we can do as a public, we can entice our elected officials in Washington, whether it be our US senators or our congresspeople, to do something about the Constitution, because this is embedded in the Constitution. We'd need a constitutional amendment to put new language in there that possibly reads like this. President still has the right to pardon or commute anyone's sentence. However, he can't do so or she can't do so if that person was convicted of a crime involving the president. If that person is a friend of the president and it's some type of nepotism or a family member of the president, it's possible that the US population could get together and entice their Congress people to do that. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do. To date, from the inception of this country in 1776, we've only had 33 amendments to the Constitution. The last one, which is the 33rd, was from the early 90s. To get that, you need a 2/3 vote of both the senators and the House of Representatives. And then, after they vote for that, you have to then send it to the states for the states to agree. And the states need to be 75% of the states have to vote for it. So you can see how difficult a process it would be to amend the United States Constitution, and that's why we've only had 33 amendments thus far in the country's history. But yes, the Roger Stone commutation leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, and it's something that we all need to think about in terms of going forward. Who do we want our president to be? Because who the president is determines the types of sentences that gets pardoned or commuted.
Oh, thank you, Roger. Thank you for that. Next, armed black protesters showed up at a protest in Louisiana. All of them had weapons, but they were all licensed. It was met with a little bit of pushback. What is your take on that?
Interesting. Well, the Congresswoman earlier spoke about the Second Amendment briefly in regards to guns. Under the Second Amendment, we have a right to bear arms. Now, that right has certain limitations. For example, if you are a convicted felon, you no longer have a right to bear arms. If you are a law-abiding citizen, you could bear arms provided you have a license and you go through background checks and what have you to know that you are somebody who is stable enough to carry arms, and that the purpose of carrying those arms is not to commit any type of criminal activity. So what happened in Louisiana recently was they're having a lot of protests, again, emanating from the Black Lives movements, to tear down or remove Confederate-era statues and monuments. And there were a group of black women in Louisiana who had a permit to protest and was at a protest site. And what happened, a counter-protest group showed up, primarily white men. Some of them were bikers, I was told, and they were brandishing weapons in a threatening way towards these black women, to, in essence, prevent them from peacefully doing what they had a First Amendment right to do, which is to protest. So word of that got out, and then some black men, and I have to really commend them because this is very chivalrous on their part, they showed up with arms to protect the black women from these white counter-protesters who were also armed, and they were legally permitted to do that. Yes, it created some eyes, some folks, wow, blacks with guns is not a good thing. But these were people who were law-abiding citizens, and that's why there were no arrests. The black men were not arrested because they legally had the right to bear those arms, and those guns were legal. Now, the focus of a lot of the articles was black men with guns, and the focus should have been black men with guns protecting black women from white men with guns.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you. That's incredible. That your information, your research is second to none. We had posed the question earlier to Gracia. She is a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you think the surge in gun violence has distorted what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about?
I'm not sure it distorted it. It may have shifted the focus a little and give some of the systemic racists individuals an opportunity to point a finger and deflect somewhat. Now, mind you, any killing of black people, whether it's black on black or white cops killing black people, those folks are still dead at the end of the day. So we cannot embrace that. But there has been black on black violence and gun violence long before the Black Lives Movement came into being. So let us not take our eyes off the prize, because a couple of weeks ago we spoke about the strides that has been made as a result of the Black Lives Movement and still are being made as we speak today. For example, this week the Washington Redskins spent a lot of time trying to untangle themselves from the 45-year history or so of the racist name attached to that team. They finally voted a week ago that, you know what, the time has come for us to rethink the name, and they exploit many other names, but at the end of the day, they will no longer be known as the Washington Redskins. That's the Black Lives Matter movement. That has opened the door and shined a light on all these racist institutions and making them check themselves. Now, I want everybody to be clear. They are only being embarrassed into doing the right thing, and it's costing them money. Let me tell you, FedEx, who sponsors their stadium, pulled away and said, wait a minute, if you're going to keep that racist name, we can't give you the naming rights anymore. We can't sponsor you anymore. Nike did the same thing. As a matter of fact, on Nike's and Adidas's website, they pull all Washington Redskins memorabilia. They're not selling it anymore because they want to be seen to be on the right side of this issue. And what created that? The Black Lives Movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. So they could try and obfuscate as much as they want where it comes in terms of the gun violence. Yes, it's a problem. Yes, we have to do something about it, whether it be legislation, as the Reverend said, faith-based issues to get to the bottom of these causes. But at the end of the day, the Black Lives Matter movement has nothing to do with the rise in gun violence. That is a systemic, endemic situation that we have had for at least 100 years in terms of gun violence.
100% Roger. As always, all the facts, very reliable facts. We're going to take another commercial and we will come back with closing remarks. We're at the bottom of the hour.